Daniel, it's really great to sit down with you. We're all at a conference together, which is the first time that we spent any kind of quality time together. You've been on our podcast, we've been on your podcast before, and I'm really looking forward to kind of talking a bit about the topic of spiritual practice, because the really interesting, one of the interesting things about your podcast to me is that you're doing it from the middle of a kind of modern monastery in Vermont. So you've got this kind of combination of the deep conversations you're having on the podcast with a deep kind of immersion in contemplative practices. And I'm probably going to kind of butt out a little bit because Ali has been a meditation teacher for many years and has a kind of real strong background in this area. So it'd be really interesting to talk about kind of practices, the pros and cons, and kind of what there is to know. Because I know that a lot of people on our podcast are really interested in, okay, they're watching these kind of discussions of these big ideas, but what are the things that they can do in terms of kind of building up sovereignty, building up contemplation, and kind of embodiment?
Yeah, and I think the other thing is there's a lot of interest in myself, but also I know from people writing to us asking what practices work best for, say, collective intelligence, for being able to have a difficult conversation, for just personal growth in general. It's a very interesting question, and obviously there's no necessarily easy answer, but I think something I'm really keen to talk about, because I think we both have, or all three of us have a experience of a combination of different ways of enhancing self-understanding, or different ways of understanding our minds and bodies. Yeah. And it's really interesting to compare notes and just see, okay, well, what's useful for what, and what combination of things is particularly useful.
Yeah, and what's coming immediately to mind is, so the monastic academy, when it started, was more or less a kind of traditional monastery. So the main practice, other than the kind of community itself, which is a kind of technology of transformation, was just seated contemplative practice. Obviously, you're also meeting with the teacher, which is a kind of transformative practice, but mostly it was just sitting a lot with particular techniques that were meant to augment your perception in certain ways that would provide insight. But over the years, partly because I think we're concerned with engagement in the world, and partly I think, or I suspect, because of the unique attributes of the modern mind and the condition of the modern person, we've introduced practices like circling and trauma release techniques. And so we found that those three technologies of circling, trauma work, and meditative practice, it's a really great kind of ecology of practices, as John Vervaeke would say.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about Vervaeke as well in a bit, because I think he's bringing a really interesting piece of the puzzle to this. I find it cool that you came to a similar conclusion that I came to teaching practicing meditation. Well, actually, to rewind a bit, I got into wanting to meditate from a psychedelic experience I had when I was 18. So it was very much an experience of immediate, deep connection and interest. And I remember feeling very much that, a feeling of homecoming when I had my first psychedelic experience, almost like a remembering, oh yeah, of course. That was the feeling. And then got into meditation and practiced a lot and was very interested in it. But I noticed over the years, especially in the previous conversation with Mike from Future Thinkers, you mentioned something that really strikes me, which is this experience of humiliation, or experience of going through the long, dark night of the soul. And I remember vividly having that experience for a couple of years and realizing, meditation doesn't seem to be working by itself to get me out of this. Definitely helped, but so some of the practices I've noticed work really well and fill in a gap that meditation doesn't necessarily fill in, at least in the way it's taught sometimes, is challenging thoughts, for example. So CBT, I've done CBT therapy in the past, and that combination I find very interesting, because there's awareness and allowing things to arise and pass, but without also challenging the thoughts, which is not something you would really be told to do in a Zen retreat. Yeah. They're like, nah, just sit.
So CBT is cognitive behavioural therapy.
Yeah, which has been compared to Stoicism.
Well, the origin was Stoicism. I think we had a film with Jules Evans where he made that comparison. It's actually the common root of a lot of these therapies is Stoicism.
which and it is very effective. It's also been criticized because, especially in the UK, it's the kind of go-to therapy for everything because it's fairly inexpensive. So it's not a fix-all for everything. So that's a valid criticism. But what's very useful is it's about observing thoughts, challenging them, and in fact, Jonathan Haidt and who's the person who wrote the book, The Coddling of the American Mind?
Greg Lukianoff.
Yeah, so he had done CBT and noticed that a lot of what was happening on campuses, the kind of incredible sensitivity, the black and white thinking, are exactly what you train yourself out of with something like CBT, right? And I think meditation by itself isn't quite enough for that. So I'd be keen to hear a little bit more about how do you combine those practices and how much time are you spending, for example, meditating in the monastery, and how much time are you spending coming together and circling and other practices?
Yeah. So I can kind of talk about the breakdown of time spent in the various practices, and I just want to affirm what you're saying now, and that's actually something that's recently becoming quite clear to me, is that there is this other move of kind of like learning how to think about, like, to yourself, almost like creating a dialogical relationship with your own mind. And Vervaeke, again, like nails this. He calls this like internalizing the sage, right? And that actually Socratic dialogue was meant to then become a psychotechnology that you like installed in your own mind so that you could inquire into the content of your own thoughts so you wouldn't delude yourself. And I think it's right on. And like how to do that well and skillfully and reliably is a great question. And CBT, I think, is part of it, but it only gets you out of certain kind of pathological thinking. I think it doesn't open up like new ways of seeing or challenge like cultural constructions or those kinds of morality plays that we might be subject to. But it's something I'm really interested in for sure. And there's elements of that in Buddhism. Like if we think that the meditation is just one part of the Eightfold Noble Path, right? And like right view is in a certain way an invitation to think differently, right? To consider differently and to relate to your mind differently. And as, again, Vervaeke, because he's so much a part of my thinking around this, it's like these things are ecologies, right? We can't just unbundle meditation and imagine it to do the work of the transformation that the Buddha was pointing to. It's like it's a thing, it's an ecology. It comes and arises together. It's not like a one-fold path with like 7 things also there, right? It's like it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. And so, at the monastery, we still spend most of our time meditating. Like most of our practice time is spent in meditation, about 3 hours every day, with some time spent chanting too. And then, probably like 2 to 4 hours spent circling a week, with a once every 2 or 3 months a circling retreat, which is amazing. If you've never done like a full-on kind of dive into a practice like that, it's a very unique experience. And just having that kind of mega dose of the authentic relating we space, dialogical relational space is like, it's a lot, and it's very transformative, and it's like a psychedelic peak experience for a lot of people that participate in it. And then we, of course, did like a silent retreat once every month or so. The trauma work is usually more of like an ad hoc basis. So what we notice is that in the midst of circling or in the midst of meditation, often you'll encounter stuck parts of yourselves or triggers that then, if you know to kind of invoke the trauma technique, you can then relate to that in a way that releases it. And then you can get back to actually being in relationship or like concentrating, right? Focusing and being in flow. And so that one is kind of more like leveraged as appropriate, because you don't want to just spend all your time like looking for trauma, because you're just going to keep finding more. So it's more of a kind of responsive piece.
Yeah, I'd really like to circle back to something you said, which is the unbundling of meditation, because when I was running a meditation school with my wife, my now wife, we consciously made it accessible to stressed out Londoners. Even though we both have a spiritual practice of our own, we're very conscious of, okay, I don't want to hoist that on someone else. And so what we'll do is we'll teach the very phenomenological. That's kind of one of my areas of interest, and something that I've always been, I guess, is the phenomenology. So what's happening step by step in my own mind is something I've usually been able to witness quite well and go, okay, that led to that, and this led to this, and when I resisted, this happened, etc. So we were like, okay, we'll just do it phenomenologically, and we'll just do the step by step, and it worked in the sense that we taught people how to meditate, and then we gave a reading list, and we were like, kind of find your own spirituality as a container, and that doesn't really work, because it's way more complex than that. And so the container within which, like the ontological structure, the epistemological assumption, all of it that goes with it is key. And something like Buddhism has spent a long time developing that. Whereas when we're trying to bring these practices in now, it's really tricky, because what are we going to use? You know, we use the hero's journey in our men's retreats, and that's very effective because that is a universal. But I wonder on a broader level what your thoughts are on that. Like, what do you guys use? You know, do you have one, or is it, you know, how does it work?
I mean, we're working this out, and I think it's like one of the primary demands of our time is to kind of figure out this question, or really speak into this question, work into this question, because you can't just take what Buddhism developed, because we're in a different context, we're in a different time, we have different challenges culturally, systematically, like it's different now. And like even like the trauma that's stored in our minds, like maybe it wouldn't have even been appropriate to do trauma work like 300 years ago or something. Who knows? You know, it's different now. And so we need a new ecology of practice along with new like kind of ontologies and ethos, and all that stuff seems to want to be tweaked and updated and made relevant. And
it's also about what kind of narrative you're fitting it inside, isn't it?
Exactly.
I mean, is there a narrative? I mean, it's not.
Well, so
is it very Eastern influenced?
So at the monastery, like part of the narrative, right? So the full name of the space is the Monastic Academy for the Preservation of Life on Earth, right? So that there is a narrative around like this time on our planet is a time when we need to step up and transform ourselves for the sake of the whole, right? That was not a thing 500 years ago, right? That didn't need to be a thing, but our sense is that it does need to be now. I think that's also present, like even in like our space, our media space, right? That there's like an extra kind of urgency to the development work we're doing because of like we're in this together. And as far as like the whole like epistemological, metaphysical stuff, like for me, I mean, we're still working this out. We're all still working this out, but for me, it's like it is phenomenological at the base of it, and really like almost like dancing around those questions so that you can present this stuff in a way that doesn't activate ideological tripwires, but does not also then amputate the depth. And that's a hard dance to do. But if you kind of really own that phenomenological perspective, you can do a lot of work. You can do a lot there. Like even things like metaphysics and epistemology comes into your phenomenology, right? So you can actually work with it there. You can work with it there, and in that way you can actually like poke at some of these metaphysics or epistemologies that we might not be so comfortable with or think need to be updated or released or whatever, without having to confront them like logically or in terms of argumentation or things like that. Yeah.
It's really interesting. What comes up for me as you talk about that is, well, this idea of narrative is a key. I wrote a piece recently called A Story to Bind Us, which, you know, I'm fascinated by this. Like, where is that narrative? And in fact, at this conference, I had a moment of like, a kind of aha moment, which is going to sound really mundane, right? It's around the idea of ancestors, right? And why that's important and why that whole idea is important. To be honest, because of the circles I move in, I've had a lot of hippies telling me about ancestor stuff. And I've kind of looked a bit snippy, like, oh my God, if I hear another thing about ancestors and this and tapping. So I've had this kind of blockage around it. Yeah. And I've thought, and then someone said something yesterday where they were using the example of the Maori and why they connect to the ancestors. And I've always, you know, been interested in it. But what struck me is that if we want a new narrative, and if we want a narrative that kind of starts, or several, that starts paving the way for an ecology of practices and other things, then we do actually need to delve very deeply into our ancestors and the history, because and it's a very simple thing, I'm sure a lot of people already have this conclusion, we don't know where we're going otherwise, because it's the equivalent of starting a TV show in like season 9, and you're like, what the hell is going on? Who are these people? Why are they doing this? Why is this person behaving in this way? Why is this, or starting like a 10 novel series at book 5. So without having that basis of narrative up until this point, it feels very difficult to create a narrative for the future to me. And I notice in myself a tendency to feel a little bit disconnected from history, ahistorical. So I'm just wondering about that and it's a tricky one because it starts getting as well into territory of, how do we start doing what Terence McKenna called the archaic revival? How do we not do something like, we're going to honor the ancestors in a way that isn't really fit for the modern era, but do it in a way that does work, if we need to do it. I know it's interesting to hear your thoughts.
So what comes up for me is the work of Joanna Macy and her kind of like, her deep time practices, right? So this invitation to get to an embodied sense of like, you are the cutting edge of 14 billion years of evolution. And what is it like to actually feel that? And that's both like fucking, cells, figuring out how to become 2 cells or something, but it's also your ancestors coming down out of the trees, right? And starting to feel the flavor of that kind of evolutionary history and trajectory that we're a part of, I think is actually like really meaningful, right? For then also orient ourselves towards future generations too, and kind of forcing this window open of the present moment so that it's connected to the past, but also like, there's a kind of meaningfulness of how we act now in terms of how it impacts the future. Yeah, so I feel that,
I like what you say in that, because I think what I was trying to say, and now it clicks for me, is that the danger potentially of the ancestry thing is that it goes right back into tribalism.
Right, yeah, so whose story are you telling?
Whose story are you telling?
Right? Yeah, whose story are you telling?
That's a very human one. That kind of, and a story that begins with that, I think, is quite powerful. I know, do you know Ranulph Fiennes, the explorer? He's an explorer, basically. And I saw a talk of his one time, and he said that he realized that when he was exploring and climbing a mountain or going across a glacier, he needed let's say a meta-narrative, a grand narrative, to give him the resilience to push through. He wasn't particularly religious, so what he chose is that his father had been an explorer, I think, and his grandfather, and they had both kind of been in wars, etc. And he was like, I can't let them down. I'm holding some kind of lineage, and it's their memory that I'm doing it for, and they're kind of passing of the ball to me. And if I drop that, I just can't drop that ball, right? Yeah. So that it doesn't, I wonder, does it matter? It does matter, I think, what the narrative is, but it's just interesting how it can be.
Well, it's flexible, right? And that's, I think, part of what the focus on phenomenology reveals to us is that all of these things which we think are static and objective are actually participatory, right? And so like the narratives we construct, we're not orienting towards like fundamental truth, objectivity when it comes to the stories we tell. And part of our consideration ought to be like, what do our stories invite us to be, right? So when we tell a story like of evolutionary history and like we're at the like cusp of a transition and we need you and like you're going to be responsible for giving a future to the future that is actually worth living in, like, is it true? I mean, that's relevant, but it's not the only question, right? Is what does that do for you, right, in your life, and like in terms of the meaningfulness you feel when you like live according to that. And I think that is what it means to kind of be in this weird transitionary space where we know from postmodernity that like we can't do the thing that modernity tried to do. We can't like construct some fundamental final story. We just give up on that, and that's fine. We can still make something really meaningful that inspires us to be awesome, or excellent, or whatever, and it's worth it, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. It's not a question of just reviving and like, oh, we had it right back then, And that is something I think about often, because especially around the whole idea of place, for example. So very often, ancestry, history, your place in the world was very linked to geographical location. I went on a kind of guided folklorist walk by a folklorist in Wales, and he was taking us up a mountain and stopping every 5 minutes and going, it was all about Merlin, but it was tied in with actual history, and I was like, but it was fascinating because the stories were based on this particular point of the mountain right here. It happened right here, you know. Probably didn't, but what's interesting, and you know, Aboriginal Australians have that as well, this beautiful thing of song lines through the land. It's like, this is the kind of, we've mapped out the history and where we're going through the actual geographic location. Now, you know, we're all internet people, so we're completely, you know, I guess you do have a place though in Vermont. You know, you have a physical space. I wonder how important that is. How connected are you to that place?
Yeah, well, I'm learning to kind of almost like re-sacralize that place to me, or sacralize it to me. And again, it's like this, I'm learning to do this. It's not easy because I think I did grow up so removed from a sense of place. Even in the small town I grew up in, I spent most of my time watching TV or on a computer, and to really appreciate like this tree or this land or this building, this community that I'm with, is something I feel like it's like a vestigial muscle or skill that I'm like learning to flex again. And it's very awkward and difficult, but I feel like it's, yeah, like you say, it's like part of what's being asked. And I have this opportunity because, like you say, I'm like in a place. So I gotta just figure out how to do it. It's hard though. It's really hard. I feel like it's really hard.
Yeah, me too. Even as you're talking about it, I feel this like desire for it because it feels very grounding and very centering. But I then start wondering, well, where? You know, and it's an interesting. I notice there's a big impulse in that, and a lot of people really are trying to, you know, go and find somewhere and do kind of co-living somewhere and really kind of have some solid place. I think it's a natural kind of human response. Also, one of the other things I wanted to talk about that we've chatted about a little bit here is the idea of these practices being co-opted in some way and being kind of stripped of their magic, which has happened with, you know, there's a phrase McMindfulness, which is which I actually feel a little bit like I was part of, at least in London. I was, you know, the stripping of it, while it came from a good intention, does strip away some magic, and that's why we stopped doing that, one of the reasons. So, like, what are your thoughts on it? Is it a concern that you have?
I mean, it is certainly a concern. I mean, for me, this is a very, like, complicated space, because on the one hand, I think it's really important that we have these critiques of mindfulness and of spirituality, like modern spirituality. And I think we also need to have access to the perspective where it's like, this is good, this is like chill, like let this happen, it's gonna go down, like it's gonna have problems, but like it's mostly good, like let it go up, you know? And I can kind of dance between those a little bit. And I think depending on the scene or the kind of feeling or the who I'm with, I think I can occupy either perspective. Like here, the feeling is something like wanting to encourage discernment, right? Like there is, these tools are tools. It's like psychedelics, right? Like you can use them in destructive, problematic ways. And we need to understand, as part of this like larger kind of movement or network, how it is that these tools and technologies tend to get perverted. Like what happens such that that happens? And part of it is like the information ecology, and part of it is capitalism and the kind of set of incentives that it sets up such that it creates a certain lens or distortion field around these practices and technologies and epistemologies and the whole 9 yards. And so it's actually a very like sophisticated thing. And I actually think there is some truth to like Slavoj Žižek's critique, right? That like Buddhism perhaps can be considered the hegemonic ideology of late capitalism. Like just even to consider that, like to be provoked by that and be like, what is there truth in that? And like, am I participating in that? Am I using this as a kind of ideology that's just letting me be chill while the world is extracted into an early death? Like, yeah. Or am I like, no. Yeah, it might suggest something or a place to look.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's a really important inquiry. I mean, I notice as you're talking about the both good and bad of these practices being, let's say, more mainstreamed, and what that does. I notice in myself a sort of righteousness can come up because I'm quite involved in the psychedelic community and I help organize a conference, and my wife is a psychedelic researcher, so I'm kind of very much in that world. And as it's become more mainstream, I start having that feeling more and more of there needs to be some kind of way of doing it safely. Safeguarding is absolutely key, and values as well. What are the values we want to include? And so that's kind of an ongoing conversation. I talk to my wife about that a lot, and she's really concerned with that as well. It's like, what are the value structures, and how do we, how does one go about doing that? How does one go about creating a value system that isn't oppressive on people but is there for people? And I always use something like AA or those programs where they have their kind of steps and their principles, but it's decentralized, which is, it's a really interesting model. And while it might be based on addiction, I think the idea of a decentralized process that has a set of values that everyone agrees to is a really, really interesting one. And how does that actually look with a whole ecology of practices, and who sets the value? And this is something that people would need to sign, like many people would need to sign and agree to and kind of put in place. But I like that idea, because then at least everyone's accountable, but to a value rather than to a particular church or person.
Yeah, and I think there's like different spaces in which we can already see this emerging to different degrees of like rigidity and like clarity, right? Like even in our kind of media space, our media ecology, like there are kind of certain rules of engagement that are already being taken for granted and like assumed if you're going to be participating in these spaces. And it's like we're already setting up a kind of ethos and a kind of ecology of practice here where, if you don't play by the rules, then you might not, succeed in the kind of metagame that we're playing together, right? And then if you move into like a place like the monastery I live at, like there's some hardcore rules that you need to do or you will be kicked out, right? And it's like there are going to be lots of different games that we're invited to participate in, and yeah, I mean, I think we actually probably need to see a million flowers bloom kind of situation of people tweaking the rule sets of these meta games such that we can discover what works and what doesn't. Like, I hope that there are many different religions, that form very soon and that kind of afford transformation for humans and create new cultures. And we can actually that one is super messed up, like, good learning, let's not do that again, right? But this one is interesting. This is actually working for some reason. Why, And that process that we can start to go through together, I think is, because like what you say, it's complicated.
Yeah, I really resonate with that. It makes me think of the Wild West, because it's very much a frontier feeling for me, this whole space. It's like, don't know. It's really exploratory. And I did a bunch of research on the Wild West, but I got really into it a few years ago. And what I was really struck by is when they set up towns that were in no state, they were like a place like Deadwood, they would quickly realize, like, we want a sheriff. Like, someone's got to keep order here. We want a doctor. We want this. We want that. We want we want the trains to run on time, because otherwise it's just a nightmare. So they became self-organizing, and no one had to do that from on high. And then we come back to sovereignty of the individual as well, and our ability to work with each other. It feels like that's kind of happening right now in this space, whatever we call it, that we are sort of self-organizing in some way. And it's what I like about it is that it is decentralized, and in a sense, anyone can come and play the game if and if they play nice.
Yeah. And it's one of the things I really like that Bonita Roy, I think you all have had on your channel now, says is like, we've already been operating according to a distributed collective intelligence in a sense, right? It's just kind of in some ways pathological and maladaptive for the world that we're moving into. And so like looking back, and it's like, they were just like self-organizing a sheriff and like a train station and all that stuff. It's like, actually that's a very valuable way of looking. And I think it's that we're building the networks through the work that we're doing that will afford the emergence of new projects and new experiments to take place. And hopefully we'll do it with a certain level of playfulness, and we'll have, like, I think you've been talking about the kind of immune response system. So one real scary aspect of this sort of experimentation, I think kind of like similar to psychedelics perhaps, where it started to happen, and then real bad shit went down, and so we were like, whoa, is cults, right? Like, so like the fact that in this experimental space, cults might start to emerge. How do we protect against that? How do we kind of regulate that, even if it's not like from some kind of governmental body, but like how do we protect against that, guard against that, create ethical standards is a really big question for me moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's really a key point. And I think part of it is everything you were just talking about, everything we've been talking about around having the values, having that, but it's people also speaking up. And just being transparent and being like, hey, calling things out, and like not in a kind of cancel culture call out thing, but just in being like, hey, I this doesn't feel safe, let's have a conversation about it. And then I've seen it happen recently in the psychedelic community, and it worked actually. It was really cool. I was really, really happy because someone had a plan that a lot of other people disagreed with, and I thought it would just be me and a few other people who thought, no, this isn't safe, it's not a good idea. And I watched on Facebook as a lot of people started having a similar response, and it felt like, wow, it becomes a self-organizing immune system. It's like white blood cells being like, no, this isn't what we want. And that it humbled me firstly, because it took me out of my self-righteousness of like, no, I've got to somehow control the situation, into like, there's a wisdom of the field, and there's a wisdom of the people, and to trust in that is quite a process, I think, and to trust in that, and guide it in some way. We're all kind of guiding it in some way, and we're all, again, comes back to sovereignty. We all have to step into it and have to be like, willing to put ourselves out there and speak our truth. Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. That's beautiful. Yeah. And what's coming to me is like, actually, we don't need any kind of like regulation. We just need to be honest and transparent about what we see, and there will be this kind of already present immune response. Yeah.
Yeah, because if you have someone like a sheriff, say, like a meta sheriff, like I know if that were me, I would feel like, how long until I start abusing my power, right? Everyone's susceptible to that, and it's like, it's not a role anyone should want to have, nor should have, and that feels like a new, more game B perhaps, way of regulating things.
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly tricky when it comes to this stuff, because we think about like cancel culture. It's not like cancel culture, but there is an element in which it's kind of like cancel culture, right? Like, because if somebody is abusing their position or creating systemic patterns of abuse through their experimentation with this kind of field of ecologies of practice, like, you want to kind of cancel that, because people are going to get hurt. It's going to create a bad reputation for the space. It's going to create just all kinds of bad juju down the line. And yet, also, we need to be free to push the boundaries of what's considered permissible, right? You need to be able to like go really into the edge of what feels even like appropriate or safe. Like even at the monastery, like there are many times when I feel like, I don't feel unsafe because I have a different frame, but I'm like, this is like dangerous to me, right? And on the other side of that is actually breakthrough often. But it still needs to be able to have that. And some people don't break through and they leave and they're like, this is like not okay. This is like problematic or something, right? And it's like, well, we need to be able to handle that and be very discerning about if it's like actually problematic or like they're just doing experimental work and it's difficult.
Yeah, it's the frontier spirit for me.
Exactly.
It's a little bit of danger to it, and there kind of has to be, because that's where all the juice is. Yeah. Is anything coming up for you, David? You want to say?
I think this is really alive. I think this is something that I'm looking forward to talking to Jamie Wheel about when he's over in October, because I know he's thinking a lot about this. So Jamie's working on his next book, Recapture the Rapture, which is kind of an open source document for communities of practice and transformational culture, and so it's kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom. This is the manual for creating transformational, intentional communities, and we know that these have run into problems in the past, and the cult topic is definitely current, because there's a realization that not everyone who's talking using the same language that we're sort of familiar with, like not everyone talking about game B and non-rivalrous dynamics is actually at a place of development in themselves where they're actually walking the talk. And all of these sort of pathologies can be playing out in the field, and what does an immune response look like? What are maybe there is a set of principles. I don't know. I think it's worth examining whether it does make sense to actually have a sort of code of ethics or a set of principles or whatever. I suspect it might not be possible, because I think the dividing line between, especially when you get into the area of sort of crazy wisdom and sort of teachers who are able to, like, spiritual growth is uncomfortable, and it's not a palliative, and it can sometimes look unhealthy. I mean, I know, so I do wonder whether it's possible to create a set of ethics, or a sort of, this is how you recognize a cult, that would not catch some false positives in that. I don't know. I think that's a really open question. And even just raising the word, because I think a lot of people are now interested in this area, even talking about cults or cultish dynamics is a difficult place to go, because you're already starting to shine a light on the uncomfortable parts of the spiritual journey. But I think it's something that's coming ever more salient, to use John Bevacky's word.
Yeah, and I think it's a good thing to remember that harm reduction does not mean harm elimination. And I think harm reduction is a very healthy impulse. Trying to eliminate harm is a different energy of saying, oh, no, everything must be safe. It's just because, like you were just saying, it's not a safe process to have to develop oneself, and much of it is painful. That's actually one thing I wanted to ask. Is this came up in a group we did yesterday, where people often, we talk about this a lot, inner growth, inner development. If it was like CrossFit or something, you can see the before and after. Someone like, wow, I want to look like her, I want to look like him. You're like, look at that. With spiritual development, it's slower, or let's say psycho-spiritual development, inner growth. It's slower. It's kind of hard to be like, yeah, Daniel, I don't know, he's like
he's looking spiritually buff right now.
Yeah. He's more receptive than he was 6 months ago. It's quite hard to contextualize, but obviously many people around the world do these things for a reason. So I'm just wondering about, in your own life, it's interesting to see what changes have you noticed. I mean, that's a hard question, but what is something come up?
Yeah, well, so I mean, one thing that comes up is I often think about the fact that I've spent probably close to 10,000 hours just meditating, right? And usually when you spend 10,000 hours doing something, you have something to show for it. I just have nothing. Right, I have less.
But it's a bigger nothing than you had before.
I have less. I have less to show for all my work, right? And it's a little bit. There's a part of me that's I could have what else could I have done with that time? But I will say that let's see. That's an interesting question. I think the motivations for practice have changed over time. What I have noticed, and it's also hard to say because you're also just living life, right? But I think the most obvious change that's happened for me through meditation is when I think back to my first retreat, which was a 10-day Goenka retreat in Massachusetts. That was the most painful experience of my life. Right? When I left that, I was like, I am never doing anything like this ever again. That was horrible. That was just pure suffering. This is terrible. Now I sit a retreat, and it's actually mostly really nice. It's actually really peaceful. It's there's beautiful experiences. There's sacred experiences. It's not just horrible suffering. And so there's some kind of transformation of my mind or my relationship to my mind and the way I participate with my experience that, for instance, solitary confinement is a form of torture. It's considered a form of torture. And yet people go into solitary retreat. I intend to go into solitary retreat in order to be happier. How is it that it can be a torture and something that you do for your happiness, right? It's a shift. It's a shift there. And I can definitely see that just when I like sit down or do a retreat. So that's the most like palpable thing, I think, for me. I'd be curious if you want to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was going to say, well, yeah, certainly my relationships are in a continuous process of becoming more, I don't know what the word would be, richer, I guess, you know, and it's a bumpy road. It's like continuously making, you know, it always often feels like two steps forward, one step back, and like repeating patterns and falling into being activated. And like, I think that'll probably always be the case. That's what it is to relate to people. But I do notice that, you know, certain aspects that I've been working on maybe the last few years, like telling the truth more instead of holding back because I think it'll please people to do it, or I don't want to cause conflict, like that I've noticed get markedly better, that I can look back at kind of 2 years and be like, yeah, you know what, I don't think I would have said that person in that way 2 years ago. So that's really nice. That really makes me feel like, okay, let's do something. I mean, from having a meditation practice, because I started when I was like basically a teenager, I guess like a late teenager, I've never really been an adult without one. Mm-hmm. So it's hard, it's kind of hard to contextualize what it might be like. But certainly I know when my practice has slipped that I'm more reactive, and I'm less reactive and more open when it hasn't. And so there's a sense of peace, I think, more, not always, but a generalized sense of groundedness and peacefulness somewhere in myself. I notice that being kind of, and that's ever present if I can get out of my own way and let go of my own hang-ups and trying to tap into it. And when I do, then it feels like, okay.
Yeah, I'm interested in picking up something on that, because it's this distinction between the vertical and the horizontal that I think is really, really important, and I think is often missed. That there's a lot of vertical practices like meditation that don't actually shift the horizontal, the relationships. And I think I've seen a lot that people who specialize in the vertical often neglect the horizontal. Whereas the horizontal is, I've done a lot more, I'd probably say I've done probably more horizontal practices than vertical practices, though I've done breath work quite a lot, which I say is more of a vertical. And I wonder what your relationship is to that, because obviously you're more focused on the contemplative. So vertical would, I think, is sort of connecting to the transcendental, very much from a sort of contemplative position, whereas horizontal would be more group work, working with like how honest or how direct you are, your relationship with people around you, that sort of thing. Do you think what do you make of that distinction? Do you think there's a balance in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, so I think the reason why the circling trauma work meditation set of practices is so nice is that it very nicely hits the integral four-facet model of waking up, cleaning up, and showing up, right? And when you show up, you learn about what you need to clean up and so on. So there's a nice kind of like feedback loops within that. And so for me, I definitely went hard vertical like for a while, and then that revealed like, oh, this is actually not going to give me everything I want. Right, and I need to do this. I need to like work on my sense of inadequacy and like my fear of other people and like how to express my emotions. And actually, I don't even know what emotion I'm feeling. Like I should learn how to identify my emotions, you know, and things like that. And then there's also this completely different move of soul work, right, and like individuation of that process where it's like, what's my relationship with my dreams and what like. I think that's a whole different field. I was speaking earlier about one way of making distinctions is this like four-facet model. Another way is like spirit, ego, soul, right? And you say like ego is this horizontal move, like getting better relationships, so on and so forth. Spirit is this transcendental move, and soul is this kind of like downward move. And I think really you want all of them. And you want to just do the thing you're doing and not try to eat the whole cake at once. I think that's important too.
Yeah. I think that's really nicely said. And Doshin, who we've interviewed a couple of times, said they've added a fifth one, and he runs Integral Zen. So they've added fucking up to the fourth. Yeah, because that's such a deep practice, you know? Yeah, and I think it's kind of a nice thing to bring in the conversation because, you know, we were just talking about like 100 flowers blooming, and some of them are all going to work, and fucking up is part of the process.
There's one of my favorite books about meditation is Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha by this guy, Daniel Ingram. And he has this line in there somewhere. I think he's quoting somebody, but he says that the life of a Zen master is one mistake after another. Which I think it's just very good. It's very good, yeah.